Hey crafters, thanks for joining me. In this video I'm going to use some distressings and products from Lavinia Stamps. Hope you enjoy! So for this card, I used a piece of paper that's 5 by 7 inches and I used the large stencil number 9. This kit comes with 2 stencils and I'm using the one that looks like a jar. And I just put it on its side there, facing the right hand side. And I'm going to use a bit of masking tape, which is the same length as the jar. And using my scissors, I'm going to cut a wave pattern in this so that I can use this for my water. Now, if you prefer, you can rip your masking tape as well and have that as your water line. But for this card, I thought a nice, gentle line would be better. So I'm going to place the masking tape on the jar here, just so that it's right over the end of the right hand side, as you can see. And I'm going to start with some Peacock Feathers Distress ink. So I blended this, which is the darker of the 2 colors I'm going to use, mostly on the top here, starting on the masking tape and then blending down. And then once I was happy with that, I added the lighter color, which is Salvaged Patina Distress Ink, at the bottom there. And those 2 colors work so well together. And then I'm going to carefully remove that masking tape and then move it down so that it masks off the waterline. And then for the sky, I'm going to start with a nice blue. This is the Salty Ocean Distress Ink. And I'm going to concentrate the ink around the edges of the jar. So I always start by applying the ink on the mask and then, or on the sticker stencil in this case, and then onto the surface. So I drag the ink from the edges to the paper. So the inside of the jar will be mostly white, and then it'll be blue around the edges. And then this is Tumbled Glass Distress Ink, which is a very, very light blue, and I'm going to blend that in towards the middle of the card. And if you've ever used the Tumbled Glass Distress Ink before, you know that it's very light, but it does help to blend between the white and the salty ocean. And then I'm going to add a bit more of that salty ocean around the edges until I'm happy with it. Now, once I'm happy with this, I will remove the masking tape, but I will keep this for later on because I do end up adding a bit more ink to that water later on in the video. So using the Morning Mist ink, I'm going to stamp the Sacred Bridge, and I'm going to stamp this so that it's in the middle of the jar and that the edges of the bridge are just underneath the water. And I love the combination of this lovely gray with the blues in the background. Then using some baby pink ink, I'm going to stamp some Orchard Grass around the edges all over the jar here. And then using that same Orchard Grass stamp, I'm going to use the Bally Blue ink. And these are very nice light colors, which are quite subtle, but you could always darken them if you prefer a more dramatic look. And lastly, with some Warm Breeze ink, I'm going to stamp these tiny mushrooms. They're part of the Lamps set from Lavinia Stamps. And I'm going to stamp them with some 1st and 2nd generation stamping on the edges, and then a few in the water as well. and they're just the perfect size for this scene inside of this jar. Now I did decide that I wanted my water to be a little bit darker, so I'm glad I kept that masking tape. I'm just going to reapply it here and then use some washi tape to keep it stuck down now that it's lost its stickiness. And then using some chipped sapphire distress ink, I'm going to blend this on top of those two turquoise colors. And I love how with distress inks you can keep adding more colors until you're happy with the results. And this combination of the peacock feathers, the salvage patina, and the chipped sapphire, it just makes this gorgeous water at the bottom of this card here. And then I'm just going to add a bit more of that chipped sapphire around the edges. Now this is very light pressure and very little ink, just enough to give a hint of a darker blue. So I'm wiping off the excess ink and just very lightly blending around the edges. Now I can remove that sticker stencil and add the other part in. Now I wanted to continue with the gray theme, so I'm going to use Lost Shadow Distress ink and blend this around the edges. And I love adding colors around the sticker stencils, but I find it really difficult to line them up perfectly. So what I do is, once I've finished blending around the edges here, I'm going to remove the stencil, and you can see there's a few white bits there. So I'm just going to reapply it and then continue with the ink blending so that I don't have any white bits left. And I'll just do this a few times until I'm happy that I've got all the edges covered. So I'm just using a light pressure with this Lost Shadow ink and just blending around the edges. Now I'm just going to use one of the Lavinia Stamps masks and put that on the ground there, and continue using that Lost Shadow ink. I'll blend it along the bottom of the card, just so that it looks like the jar is resting on the ground. And now I'm going to use one of the stencils. This one is called Pebbles, and that same Lost Shadow ink, and just blend it over the top. So this is a very subtle pattern of pebbles with the same color of ink. So if you prefer it to be darker, you could always use a darker gray. And the same two colors of VersaFine Clair as before. This is the Bally Blue, and I will use the Baby Pink in a minute. I'm just going to use more of that Orchard Grass stamp and stamp around the edges. So not too much, but just a little bit of color around the edges. And now I'm going to remove the mask and stamp in the cork top here with that same Morning Mist ink. Now to add in my two little swans, I'm going to use some Versamark clear sticky ink and stamp them in the middle under the bridge there, and then use some white embossing powder. And then I can heat set this with my heat tool. And I prefer to heat from the back first and then heat over the image. I find that I get a nice even heat with that. And you can see the white swans look great, but they're a bit hard to see. So I'm using a black fine pen just to add some details. And I'm just following the guide from the stamps there, just going around the outside of the images, adding in some details where their eye and their beaks are. And then I'll use a orange pen. This is actually a fluorescent orange Posca pen, just to draw in their beaks. And then around the edge of the jar, I'm just using a white gel pen. You could use a Posca pen if you prefer, but what I'm doing is just using a little light pressure and then smudging it with my finger. So what you're left with is just a hint of the outside of the jar, and I really like how this turned out in the end. And then I'll also add some white details to the water around the swans there. Now to finish off this card and give it a bit more color, I'm going to use a combination of my Posca pens. But first what I did is colored in the bridge with a very light gray Copic pen. You could use a pencil crayon if you prefer. I did the same over the cork area as well. And then I added my detail with my Posca pens. So I added in 2 lily pads with the green Posca pen. And then using various colors, I just drew in some tiny flowers on the bridge. So I used some pink, some purple, and a bit of yellow as well. And I just drew very simple flowers and added a few dots on either side of the bridge as well, just to tie in those colors. And then on the lily pads as well, I added a little bit of the yellow, so it looks like there's some yellow flowers on the lily pads. And then using my white Posca pen, I just added a little white center to all of the little flowers. And I think that helps to finish it off there. Then I gave this a few moments to dry. Meanwhile, I stamped a sentiment with some Morning Mist ink. This one is Art from the Heart. And then I used a bit of that Lost Shadow Distress ink and made a little background for my sentiment. I also used my pink Posca pen to color in the little heart on the sentiment. And then I popped up the sentiment on some foam squares and put this on the front of my card. I decided it looked nice on the left-hand edge here. Then I trimmed the card just by a 1/4 inch or so on one side and the bottom. And then I can put this on my 5 by 7 inch card base so that there's a nice white edge around the outside. And I'll add my sentiment in later. Thanks for watching, and I hope you found this video inspiring. If you haven't already, please subscribe so that you're notified whenever I post a new video. Have a crafty day!